Right. Thank you so much, Chanel and Mahalo Rachel, for inviting me. And thank you to all of you for being here today. I'm so glad to be back on campus. And yeah, for the past 2 years, I've been working on this project with Conservation International, with their Center for Oceans team. And today I thought I would tell you a little bit about what this has looked like. It's a really kind of large collaborative project between a few different organizations you see listed below. But the focus has been on examining the equity impacts of voluntary sustainability standards. Okay, but first, what are voluntary sustainability standards? I have a few cans of tuna here that I thought I would pass around. Hopefully you can pass around more gently. Many of you may already be making decisions about whether to buy a seafood product or not based on what the packaging says. So, whether it's MSC certified, so if it's got that blue tick, if it has a fair trade certification, or in the case of tuna, if it's pole and line caught, if it's dolphin safe, if it's turtle safe, it doesn't use long lines. So these are all meant to signal to the consumer that, you're buying a product that's fulfilled certain requirements about its sustainability indicators. So like out of curiosity, how many of you are currently kind of making your decisions to purchase a product based on these labels? Can I just have like a show of hands? Okay, a few. And how many of you have some skepticism about what these actually may indicate? Okay, more hands. Love it. Love a skeptical audience. So what are eco labels are really part of these like larger class of voluntary sustainability standards that I'll just start calling VSS for the rest of this presentation. They include things like ratings. So Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch, has a really popular rating that you might have seen. They include things like fishery improvement projects. These are initiatives that are designed to put a fishery on track to reach certain sustainability goals. And of course, they include things like MSC, Fair Trade, Friend of the Sea. These are kind of certifications. I think today there are over 50 such labels for seafood alone. And there are hundreds more for other products, other commodities like coffee and cocoa and textiles. In the case of seafood, VSS were largely developed by nonprofits and the private sector in partnership in the early 2000s, early 2000s, late 90s, sort of in response to the collapse of the Atlantic cod fishery. So most of them have a really big focus as a result on, environmental sustainability. But today, these models that were largely built in a Western context for a particular kind of fishery are growing in low and middle income countries in small scale fisheries that I'm sure you all know are multi-gear, multi-species operations with really complex social, economic and cultural dimensions that interact with environmental governance. And a lot of the seafood in the US and in Europe, so a lot of the fish that's like reaching your plates here is really being sourced from these geographies in the global south. And VSS have now almost become a requirement to be able to access these markets, with over 21% of wild-caught seafood now certified and growing every day. VSS I'm just talking about them as VSS. They're voluntary sustainability standards. They include things like eco-labels and ratings and certifications. And part of the motivations for this project were in trying to understand how these models hold up in different contexts. So to do that, I think it's worth going over the theory of change or the logic model that a lot of these initiatives are built on, which is that consumers or retailers demand or pay more for sustainably sourced seafood. And then this sort of results in a price premium or an access to preferential markets, which creates an economic incentive for fisheries to participate. And this in turn sort of, improves the sustainability of the stock over time. So it really positions end buyer demand as the driving force of economic reward for a producer or a fishery. So they're all sort of based on this idea that there will be a trickle-down effect of monetary gains. So it's a very elegant, market-friendly idea, but we don't actually have a lot of evidence for this theory of change to see, if it's upheld, when it breaks down and why, and who is really incurring the costs and benefits of these initiatives. And in particular, we don't really understand how fishers and fishing communities perceive VSS, what incentives they have to participate in these programs, especially in small scale fisheries where they're now growing, as I mentioned, and that really, operate in dynamic spaces. Small scale fisheries are hard to define, but, when I talk about them here, I'm sort of generally referring to small production operations, relatively kind of low input, low output. They're often family run, they're smaller vessels. They are managed at a family or a community level, pretty low technology, in contrast to kind of large scale fisheries that are high tech, large production volumes, and employ a lot more people. But small scale fisheries, support millions of people worldwide. They make up almost half of the global seafood catch. So they're really critical to people's livelihoods, to food security, and to nutritional health. So this is what we kind of, the costs and benefits of participating in these initiatives is really what we set out to understand and bring evidence to. And we used a case study approach to look at 3 small-scale fisheries in the Maldives, in Indonesia, in the Maluku Islands, and in India's Park Bay, which all participate in really diverse VSS. They all have pretty different value chain structures. In the Maldives, we looked at the skipjack and yellowfin tuna fisheries that are, the skipjack fishery has an MSC certificate associated with it, and a part of it is fair trade certified. The yellowfin tuna fishery is in a fishery improvement project, or a FIP. In Maluku, Indonesia, we looked at a handline fishery for yellowfin tuna, which is also MSC certified and has a fair trade certificate. And then in Park Bay in India, we looked at a FIP for blue swimming crab, which has been in a FIP for the past 4 years and is aiming to be certified this year. So ultimately, we really just wanted to be able to look across like a diverse set of supply chains to identify, actionable steps that can be taken to prevent harms and enhance fairness in these and similar supply chains. Yeah, I won't talk too much about the methods, but please, ask me the details later. I'll just say that for each supply chain, we kind of went through this process. We started with a literature review, really trying to understand the context of each fishery, its governance context, the inequities that might already sort of be present in these places, and to identify the gaps that we kind of wanted to try to fill through the course of research. We also mapped each of these supply chains more quantitatively, so try to understand like where monetary value was accruing at every node of this supply chain. This was a really tricky exercise. And then we did a lot of interviews and focus group discussions in these 3 places, largely with fishers. So I think we interviewed about 222 folks, over 80% of whom were with fishers. And then once we'd sort of put all of that information together, we had workshops in each country to share these results and validate our findings and, bring some nuance into what we thought was happening with folks working in fisheries and seafood in these 3 places. So that just finished last month. So this is all really fresh. Just some photos of all the amazing people that I got to speak with and learn from, whose perspectives have all contributed to this work. So yeah, big thank you to everyone who, was part of this. It's definitely not my project alone. So this is kind of how we are analyzing our results. As I mentioned, we looked at 3 small-scale fisheries in these 3 places. In each place, we analyzed the impacts of the VSS at these 3 different scales. So at a global scale, we were looking at how it was interacting with like global international market dynamics, how it interacted with national or regional policy. And then finally, locally, how it affected perceptions amongst fishing communities and how it sort of interacted with that local context. And at each scale, we looked into how equity was being impacted using this equity framework proposed by Nathan Bennett and others in 2021, which covers 6 different overlapping dimensions of social equity listed here. And of course, not only do these dimensions of equity overlap with each other, but they really overlap across scales too. And finally, we built recommendations for how to enhance equity based on our findings, but organized by these 3 principles put forth in a paper from last year by Freya Croft and others on achieving fairness, respecting rights, preventing harm, and supporting flourishing. So these principles very much capture the same equity dimensions as the Bennett et al. Framework, but we found this one to be much more useful in communicating around equity and actually thinking about what actions need to be taken to enhance it. But what is social equity? So this is a really inherently complex concept. It has many different definitions, a long history of scholarship. But at its core, it refers to principles of fairness, impartiality, and justice in how people are treated. And in the context of conservation initiatives, it can be important for several reasons. Some of these could be for moral reasons. It's the right thing to do to be fair to people. For instrumental reasons, equitable processes are needed for desired conservation outcomes, or for legal reasons. So international law requires many countries to have legal responsibility to enact equity and ensure basic human rights. And then these are kind of 2 figures from the authors that I mentioned earlier. So Nathan Bennett on the left, with the 6 dimensions of equity that we sort of used to develop our interview guide in these 3 different places, and then Croft et al.'s sort of equity principles that also has these 2 different types of equity that interact with principles of equity. The 2 types, process and outcomes, can really just be thought of as the means and ends of achieving equity. So just something to sort of keep in the back of your mind. But I will say that we worked really hard to ensure that our interview instruments were sort of reflective of local context. And we had a different interview instrument for each person, depending on where they were in the value chain, if they were like an industry actor or a fisher or a woman in processing or a nonprofit representative, we had slightly different interview guides for each of those actors, because equity can sort of be understood quite differently depending on who you are, So I'm just going to highlight a few examples from each place. So let's start in the Maldives, which is in the Indian Ocean. It's a country whose tuna fishery has been key to its identity and its economic self-sufficiency. So in this case, let's just look at how the VSS is interacting with these more global scale dynamics. So just to give you a little bit of background, the Maldives pioneered MSC certification. So that blue tick that you see, it pioneered this certification in 2012. It was the first tuna fishery in the Indian Ocean to be certified for its pole and line 1x1 fleet. However, today, several Persian fleets that fish for tuna outside Maldivian EEZs are also MSC certified, and they sell into the same international markets as the Maldives does, often at much lower prices. In fact, I think it's well captured in that quote where a Maldivian scientist who we interviewed said that the accessibility to markets, the degree to which we are able to enjoy fair prices, has been diminished by Persine fisheries getting certified, which has made the product cheaper. There's a knock-on effect of certification with an excess of anything in the market. In addition, the Maldives faces really high tariffs and duties on its exports. And now it is increasingly exporting its skipjack tuna to intermediary countries like Thailand for processing because of a decline in its domestic processing capacity. So if you look at this graph on the right, which is just illustrative, so the numbers really don't mean anything, we see that the relative costs and benefits of certification, when viewed over time, are much less for the smaller scale fishery when it shares a stock with a larger scale fleet, and when both of them are certified as sustainable, and when both of them are kind of going into the same US and EU markets, and there isn't much product differentiation happening down the line. So, in this case, the elements of the theory of change that position consumer or retailer demand or this access to preferential markets as the driver of sustainable practices begins to break down, resulting in distributional, procedural, and recognitional inequities, whether that's because of the unequal cost burden of certification. So the Maldives, the MSC standard has 3 principles that you have to satisfy before you get this certificate, to do with the sustainability of the stock, reducing impacts on other species, and environmental and governance and management. So they had to make a lot of changes to be able to meet these criteria. But once they did, because it was for a shared stock of Indian Ocean tuna, those same measures essentially were used by Persine fleets to also sort of get certified without having to do this like initial work, which in some writing has been sort of referred to as a conservation burden that the Maldives sort of bore in this process. The VSS doesn't really have mechanisms to consider the interaction, this tension between a small-scale fishery and a larger-scale fleet that is fishing a shared stock, but that has unequal decision-making power at regional fishery management organizations. So in the Indian Ocean, that is the IOTC, the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission. EU fleets, or the EU, has much greater lobbying power in these spaces than small island states like the Maldives. And so they're able to push for, higher catch allocations and regulations that suit them. And the Maldives really hasn't been able to advocate for its fishery in the same way, even though they, the impacts of these fisheries on this shared stock are really different. When we look at awareness and participation just sort of at the local level, you see that in the case of MSC, even though this fishery, this fishery has been certified since 2012, almost 70% of the fishers we interviewed were not aware of this initiative and that their fishery was technically certified by MSC. In contrast, with the fair trade certification, over 80% of fishers were aware of their participation in fair trade, which was quite interesting. So it's quite interesting how these sort of different models have slightly different local impacts. The fair trade model functions quite differently from others in this space in that it deposits a premium associated with the catch into the shared bank account of the participating community. So fishers essentially see an amount deposited into a shared account that they can then collectively decide how to spend. So they have to vote on, what they spent this on. And so many folks who we interviewed had seen real tangible benefits from participating in fair trade because they'd been able to install fresh water at the harbor and put electricity up there. So they had lights when they came back and docked at night, or buy televisions for the library in their school. So it's also interesting that fair trade, has created by default, because they require this association to disperse funds. It's created this local governance structure at the local community level that didn't exist before in the Maldives. So fishers are now kind of meeting more. They're able to kind of talk more about how they want to spend these funds, but just about fishing and their lives in general, which that didn't really exist before. So that's interesting. Okay, that was an example from the Maldives. Now we will go to Park Bay, which is a small body of water between India and Sri Lanka, where a fishery for blue swimming crab, Opportunus pelagicus, has been in a fishery improvement project since 2019. And over 96% of the crab that is fished in this bay is exported to the US. So we look at a kind of more national or regional level sort of example here. Firstly, in this case, again, 58% of fishers, 100% of the women we interviewed, and 34% of the small processors we spoke to were not aware that they were in a FIP. And this is really because they have not perceived any clear benefits from it yet. Their largest concerns, which are financial, have remained unaddressed by the FIP and by other fisheries actors in this space. So the gillnet fishery for crab is sort of what is in a fishery improvement project right now. However, it shares resource space with a trawl fleet. The trawl fleet targets shrimp, but it does land crab as bycatch. Gillnet fishers leave their gillnets overnight, and trawlers then sort of often, go over it. It's not always intentional, but some of the highest costs that gillnet fishers have is from the destruction of their nets due to trawling. On top of this, in general, communities here are, living below the poverty line. There is sort of systemic debt. Someone we interviewed described it as a shared vulnerability. And these issues have not been addressed by the Fishery Improvement Project and by government or state actors. So there hasn't really been much incentive to comply with these environmental sustainability goals. So in this case, we find that there's a mismatch between the FIP unit of assessment and the larger social ecological context in which this improvement project is sort of taking place. And this results in inequities and harms to these fishing communities that the FIP is trying to serve. So because trawling has sort of been seen as not interacting with this fishery, the threats from it have not been addressed. Whereas communities see trawling as the biggest threat to their fishery. And so they don't see the FIP incentivizing their participation. So, while the FIP is trying to get fishers to leave small and buried crabs behind as part of its environmental kind of goals, no one is really doing this because they see trawlers catching those same crabs from those same waters. So here are the elements of the theory of change that say that there will be improved sustainability or there'll be a trickle-down benefit to the producer really come into question. Okay, finally, let's take the case of the elephant tuna fishery in the Maluku Islands in Indonesia that are circled in red. Here we looked at a handline fishery in 3 different islands that had communities that were either part of the MSC program or the Fair Trade program. And here we'll just sort of focus really on local dynamics. So, in contrast to other places where we saw very low participation and awareness amongst fishing communities, in Maluku, by contrast, we over 90% of the fishers we interviewed knew MSc and fair trade and perceived clear benefits from their participation in these programs, whether that was monetary, through premiums and price increases in catch value or otherwise. So this was a really significant and encouraging finding, especially because we did not see this elsewhere. These perceived benefits are really largely because of the long-term work of local organizations, specifically MDPI and AP2HI in these communities that have really built and shared capacity over time in a variety of ways. So they've trained fishers on improving catch quality. They've started financial literacy programs. They've connected women who work in processing with local buyers and markets. And they perform a really interesting bridging role between industry actors and fishing communities, and have really over time helped fisher voice their needs and challenges, and helped those be sort of elevated to these other supply chain actors. And finally, the social context is key. So communities here in general, have their basic needs met. They have access to clean drinking water. At least in the places where this work was conducted, they had access to electricity, to internet. So all of these enabling conditions, many of which have been also put in place by these, local efforts, have allowed fishers to actually see the benefits of participating in MSc and fair trade. So those were just a couple of, illustrative examples and a small piece of this project of how the VSS theory of change is sometimes supported, but very often breaks down, or is at least mediated by factors that are operating at these global or national or local scales, that have impacts on how people are able to participate in these initiatives, how they perceive these initiatives. So our goal was to really understand, where and how these disruptions occur in these three supply chains, to identify what complementary actions or initiatives can be taken to make these models more equitable. Because, these models are, these certifications are kind of here to stay. They're just now a feature of the market. There's a huge amount of money that's put into them year after year, but there's been not much critical evaluation of sort of the premise that they're based on. I'm not going to go into this right now, but happy to come back to it. This is sort of the more quantitative work we did, looking at how monetary value is accruing along these supply chains. Largely, we see that, fishers receive anywhere between 6 to 22% of the final retail price of a product, and a lot of the monetary value continues to accrue in the more US, parts of the supply chain. So we visualize the impacts of a VSS as an iceberg. Currently, we really only monitor or pay attention to what's sort of visible above the waterline. So, some environmental sustainability metrics and some economic sort of benefits, even though the economic stuff is actually really hard to access because there aren't that many seafood businesses and companies who are transparently reporting on things like pricing, so this is already like hard to get. However, and our work, and I think a growing amount of kind of awareness in this space, shows that to really have lasting outcomes and to really have the larger determinants of success are really dependent on what might lie below the surface. So in the ways in which fishing communities are able to participate in or lead decision-making, so procedural equity, who is included in those processes. So often women, who are critical parts of these fisheries, are completely left out of these export-oriented supply chains because their role is really more in domestic and local markets. And finally, the structural barriers that prevent equitable access to benefits. So contextual equity here is like really key because these are all kind of the same model that are being applied in really diverse scenarios. with very unequal impacts as a result. Yeah, and that's kind of, so what we wanted to build through our workshops, and with people working in these places was really how equity can be enhanced, either whether through VSS or outside of that. And we had several recommendations for each of these places, but I'll just talk about 4 sort of big ones. So because context is so important, like I've mentioned, we think that developing these place-specific certification guidelines prior to the implementation for VSS can really help identify existing inequities and put in place mechanisms proactively to mitigate or address them through cross-sectoral partnerships. So we find often there are local organizations or efforts being made to address some of these socioeconomic concerns in fishing communities, but fisheries management is like operating in its own silo outside of that. And so, sometimes it's just people need to be in the same room a little bit more and realize that they actually are working towards shared goals. But we think that maybe having kind of a go, no-go decision-making framework can help make some of these challenges visible prior to implementation. Secondly, a significant proportion of small-scale fishers worldwide are living at or below the poverty line. And these economic concerns are only being exacerbated by climate change. We've seen evidence from some other sectors like coffee and cocoa that setting living wage benchmarks and thinking of living income as a lever for sustainability and change can be an effective tool for business operations to kind of operationalize some of their sustainability commitments. Especially if these are then paired with regional or fishery-wide financial literacy programs. So it's interesting in this case to kind of compare seafood with other commodities, like textiles or cocoa or coffee, where in some of these other cases, like labeling or the drive for labeling, eco-labeling certifications, all of that stuff really came from consumer concerns about labor conditions. And so the social and the economic sort of concerns of these communities were often at the forefront of those conversations. It also took a lot of advocacy efforts. In seafood, because the drive has been more environmental, it's sort of left out all these other aspects of fishing and fishing communities. And they're sort of now, businesses feel like they are doing a lot already, and they're being asked to do a lot, and sort of talking about equity on top of that, especially in this climate, is challenging. But Conservation International sort of does do some work now in many places, actually implementing our variation of a fishery improvement project called a community FIP, which really focuses on supporting community-led efforts and fortifying domestic and local market linkages and integrating social and economic dimensions of fisheries. This also sort of aligns much better with sustainability development goals, international human rights frameworks, and it's been implemented successfully in communities in South Africa, Costa Rica, Mexico, etc. So it's not that businesses or initiatives, don't want to engage. I think it's just finding the right places and the right groups can sometimes take time. And finally, our data shows that the reliance in all 3 cases on these kind of single export markets not only makes these supply chains less resilient, but also excludes a lot of informal workers, including women, a lot of migrant workers in these fisheries who are continuing to play really important roles, but who are really not seen in these initiatives. So I think we're really interested in thinking about how domestic markets can be better supported, for instance, through engagement, with the tourism sector in places like Maldives and Indonesia. CI again has piloted some like successful initiatives. One of them is called Eco Gourmet, which links fishers directly with retailers and hotels and commercial partners, enabling them to get a much better price for their catch, and then also enabling these establishments to source locally and to source sustainably. And finally, ultimately, we really need to expand our ideas of monitoring. Equity needs to be a really clear and explicit goal of a lot of these initiatives. One of the things that we did as part of this work was value alignment, which is our value alignment analysis, which is really it looks at how diverse groups in seafood and fisheries, in the nonprofit sector, in philanthropy, in business, how they're talking about equity, or if they're talking about equity. And what we found was that they're not, for the most part. And in the few cases where they do mention equity, it's sort of more of an aspirational goal rather than something that can be operationalized and tracked. And it's understandable because equity is not a straightforward thing to understand and to monitor well. But I think if we're really interested in a sustainable seafood sector that is resilient and just, then equity needs to be kind of a core component of a lot of these market-based conservation or sustainability initiatives. So yeah, that's all I've got for you today.